Hello, dear soul, welcome to Sleepy Whispers, a quiet corner of the night. Just for you. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in gently. Find a place where you can rest, where your body feels safe and supported. Maybe you're already tucked beneath soft covers, the air around you just the way you like it. So you'll always have a story waiting for you, waiting like a lantern lit in the window of a quiet and ready to guide you home. Let your hands be soft. Your jaw unfastens. There is nowhere else you need to be. Feel the hush start to settle, like snowflakes drifting through the dark. Beyond the muddy roads and merchant carts, beyond the town squares where children laugh and dogs chase carts, lies a stone monastery, its walls softened by ivy, its bells long since worn to a mellow tone. A few low murmurs in the hallways, the soft rustle of pages turning in the chapel where a brother finishes the morning psalm, the scent of damp parchment and melting wax, and always the ink. He loves how it clings to the quill's tip, reluctant, how it slips and sinks into the vellum, how a single stroke can hold 1,000 meanings. Dark, mysterious, alive. Feel yourself growing heavy, safe, and still. But then, it happened again. And again. Not just the red, but the blue. And gold. Especially gold. As spring slowly turned the hills green, Emery spent more and more time in the scriptorium, tucked into the corner by the high window, where sunlight fell in long golden slants through the old glass panes. Ah, the gold, made from powdered leaf as thin as breath, suspended in honey water, it shimmered with each flicker of flame. And it was not only sound. Sometimes, it was a feeling. A memory not quite yours. A dream not quite dreamt. Like a story the ink wanted to tell, but not with words. The day he mixed the gold was the day everything changed. Not exactly. Within these walls lives a boy, perhaps 15 summers old. The oak gall black, rich and deep, like the lowest note on a monastery organ. The red, warm and flickering, like a fire just beginning to crackle. The ultramarine blue, made from lapis lazuli brought from far-off Afghanistan, sang like winter wind over snow. Just the whisper of a tone. Made from crushed cinnabar stone, mixed with wine and a trace of egg white. Immerse is a scribe, an apprentice in scriptoria, where ink and silence meet. When he lit his candle beside the red jar, it hummed. Not a sound you'd hear with ears, but something you feel, like the way your chest hums after hearing a deep bell, a vibration beneath the skin. His name is Immerse. And certainly not Prior Reese, whose stern frown made silence seem like mercy. Every morning, before the sun climbs over the far ridge, he rises with the tolling of the Lauds bell, his feet brushing the cold stone floor, his rough woolen robe brushing against his ankles. He never told the other scribes. Not Brother Iwan, who was always bent double over his psalter. Not Brother Maddock, who coughed when the ink was too thick. Maybe there's a pillow beneath your cheek, the fabric cool and smooth, cradling your head in the most familiar of ways. Or perhaps you're still preparing for bed, brushing away the dust of the day, just know, wherever you are, this space is yours. My name is Leah, and tonight I'll be your guide through a sleepy, golden-lit journey. And if you enjoy drifting away to gentle tales like this one, feel free to subscribe to our channel. The monastery rests in timeless stillness. Now, take in one slow breath, in through your nose, and out through your mouth. Let your shoulders relax with the exhale. And now, if you're ready, our story tonight begins in a place where silence holds its kind of music, where candlelight flickers on ancient stone, and the ink itself, seems to hum. Our story begins in the Welsh hills, cloaked in early spring mist, in a monastery tucked between folds of time, far from the noise of the world. The hills around it roll gently, like someone sleeping beneath green blankets, and here, between lamb-dotted meadows and wildflower hedgerows, the monastery is still half asleep at this hour. To really listen. And what he found was astonishing. Each ink had its tone. Immerse loves the ink most of all. But lately, something curious has begun to happen. Something gentle, quiet, and strange. It started with red ink. At first, Immerse thought it was the wind, or perhaps a trick of the mind, weary from copying verses deep into the night. The moment his brush touched the page, he felt it, a low, steady pulse like a lullaby sung by the ink itself. No, this secret was Immerse's. His and the ink's. There, beside his candle and inkstones, he began to listen. But only when the candle was lit, and only when Immerse held the quill just so, breath held, heart calm. Only then did the ink reveal its voice.
The morning light that day had arrived, gently pushing through the mist, as though it didn't wish to disturb the hush that lay over the hills and within the scriptorium, where time moved slower than it did in the world beyond the stone walls. Immerse sat quietly, carefully grinding gold leaf into a glass bowl, his hands moving in slow, practiced circles, and his breath steady, deep, and calm. The gold leaf was fragile, like the wings of a moth, and had to be handled with reverence, its edges curling under even the slightest draught. And somewhere in the distance, a raven called once and then fell silent again, as though sensing the sacred stillness that had settled over the scriptorium. Inside, Immerse leaned in closer to the page, watching as the gold dried to a fine shimmer, neither dull nor garish, but soft, like sunlight caught in a river's eddy, and he felt as though, for just a moment, the world had narrowed to the breath between brushstrokes, the slow beat of his heart, and the warm flicker of the flame at his elbow. So Immerse had shut the window tight, letting only the warmth of the morning sun bathe his bench, while the air inside the chamber remained still, thick with the soft scent of beeswax and parchment dust. Immerse felt himself sinking deeper into a rhythm older than language, older than even the letters he so carefully shaped. He imagined the monks who had come before him, hands dusty with pigment, eyes bleary from candlelight, all of them part of a silent lineage, keepers of a sacred craft, each one listening, in their own way, to the quiet music of ink and story. He thought of the colors as voices, each one carrying a piece of some great, slow song being written across centuries. And in that moment, he knew without question that he had been called to this work, not by any bell or brother, but by the ink itself. Soft and low like a lullaby sung in an unfamiliar tongue, and other times higher, thinner like the cry of a reed flute heard through morning fog. The ink continued to hum, sometimes Immerse began to notice patterns in the tone's rhythms hidden within the silence between strokes, as if each color carried a note in a secret melody made from stone and maps that had journeyed from mountains far to the east beyond deserts and rivers and cities he had only read of in margins. The stone had been ground slowly over days, washed and sifted and purified until what remained was a blue so deep it seemed to hold the night sky within it, and when he opened the jar he swore he caught a whiff of something strange, not unpleasant but earthy, mineral like rain on slate. He dipped his pen into the blue, and as he began to write, the tone that rose to meet him was clear and piercing, like the first note of a hymn rising in an empty chapel, and it filled his chest with something that felt very close to wonder, one that only the candle could reveal, and the thought filled him with a quiet awe that made his hands tremble with reverence rather than fear. He had learned from Brother Iwan that to make true chrysography ink, the kind used for illuminating sacred letters, Immerse remained behind, claiming penance for a mistake he had not made, for he wished only to return to the ink, to sit once more in the deepening hush of twilight and listen. As the sky outside turned a dusky lavender and the candlelight grew stronger by contrast, the scriptorium took on a different quality, one that felt older than even the monastery itself, as though the walls remembered every word ever written within them, and the air was thick with the presence of stories not yet told, and royal names. One needed to mix the gold with a few drops of gum arabic dissolved in rose water, and stir it with a slender birchwood rod, never metal, for metal would disturb the balance of the mixture. Or so the old scribe believed, and Immerse had come to trust that sometimes it was not science, but devotion, that made ink truly shine. The rose water released its faint fragrance as he stirred something sweet and far away, like the memory of a garden scene once in a dream, and the gold, once stiff and dry in its leaf form, softened into the mixture like melted starlight, catching the candle's glow with each pass of the rod. When he dipped his brush, made from squirrel fur bound to a swan quill handle, into the golden ink and laid the first curve of a capital letter onto the stretched calfskin parchment, he felt it again, a vibration that was not a sound but a presence, something low and resonant like a far-off bell rung underwater. The sensation passed through him, and he realized in that moment that he was not merely writing but listening, not creating. And it hummed through his fingertips, through the very marrow of his bones, as though the gold was not merely pigment, but memory whispering something forgotten. Immerse paused, letting, but translating, as though the ink already knew the words it wanted to become, and he was only the vessel through which they passed. And curling with careful grace, each stroke deliberate, each pause filled with the breath of ancient ritual, and all the while outside, the wind stirred the ivy that grew thick along the outer walls of the monastery, its leaves brushing against stone like fingertips against an old tapestry. As the hours passed, the script grew across the page, like ivy itself winding. Later that evening, when the bells called the monks to supper and the hall filled with the gentle clink of spoons and the rustle of robes on stone, in that golden hush Immerse opened a fresh page and reached for the ultramarine, the most precious of pigments. The ink did not merely sit on the page, it settled, nestled into the vellum as though it belonged there, and with each stroke, and the ink, it seemed, was dreaming. The days that followed unfolded like parchment under warm hands, slowly, gently, quietly, each one stitched to the next with the soft thread of candlelight and the deepening mystery that surrounded the ink's song. Immerse began to keep his own secret book, bound in goat leather the color of dried leaves, its pages filled not with scripture or translation. He was quiet, polite, always diligent in his work. And the scriptorium was lit only by the 3 small tapers Immerse had kept burning low, that he discovered something entirely new. The wind outside had stilled, the stars had begun to blink softly into being beyond the high window, and Immerse bent low over a sheet of tightly ruled vellum. had just touched his quill to the page when a chill passed through the air, not cold exactly, but expectant. He looked up. When he stayed behind after prayer or lingered long after Vespers, they assumed he was pious, or perhaps simply meticulous. The gold-illuminated letter A, freshly painted, seemed to ripple. All at once, but not in chaos. It was harmony. A soft chord. A song sung from the inside out. Just for a moment. As if a breath had passed beneath it. Brother Iwan even praised him once, murmuring over his shoulder, "You have a scribe's patience, boy, and a bishop's hand." The strokes came effortlessly, elegantly, with a speed and grace he had never known before. Words formed, not in Latin, not in Welsh, but in a script unfamiliar and ancient, curving and branching like vines across the parchment. He dreamed of golden rivers, of voices made of color, of a great library without walls, where books turned their own pages and whispered their contents into open ears. And when he woke, the morning bell was ringing, and the room smelled of dust and dawn, and all felt unchanged, and yet, something within him had shifted. And Immerse was learning to read not just with his eyes or his mind, but with something deeper, something that listened the way roots listen to rain beneath the soil. It was beautiful. Breathtaking. And though he could not read it, he understood, deep in the quiet heart of him, that it was not nonsense. Each time, the ink told him something new, not always with song, but with texture, scent, weight. Refused to show color at all unless read by firelight. Some would bloom instantly. Others required waiting. One, made from crushed berries left under the full moon. And yet all of them spoke, in their own way, when the time was right. Immerse only smiled faintly, dipping his quill into violet ink that had begun, quite recently, to whisper in his dreams. The way the birds fell silent just before the ink began to sing. The way the breeze that passed through the scriptorium windows always smelled faintly of myrrh when he used the red. The way the flame of his candle never guttered, no matter how late he worked, when he used the blue. These were invitations. These were not accidents. But with the sounds and sensations of the inks themselves, little notes scribbled in the margins, and every few days, he would return to it, drawing more from the ink when it called to him. And when at last he leaned back, rubbing his eyes, he saw what he had written and felt no fear, only awe. Tiny illuminated initials framing observations, red glows when it rains, or blue hums stronger near sunset, that became his hiding place. Writing pages that felt like dreams given form, each more intricate than the last. And gold knows when I am afraid. The other scribes never questioned him. It was during one such evening, when the monastery had fallen into the deep stillness that comes after Compline, the ink on the page, still wet, shimmered faintly, more than before. He blinked. Waited. Silence. But when he looked again, the gold line was dry. Still, the sensation remained, the feeling that something had shifted, something had leaned in. He set down the quill and reached for the small horn cup of water he kept beside the inks, sipping slowly, letting the warmth of the room return to his limbs, steadying himself. He listened, truly listened, not just with ears, but with his entire being, the way one listens for snowfall or remembers a name in a dream. The room held its silence like a sacred bowl. Then, softly, ever so gently, the ink began to hum, not just the gold, but the blue and red, and even the black. And Immerse, stunned but calm, reached once more for his pen. What flowed onto the page next did not feel like his own hand. The ink was speaking. He wrote until the candle burned low and flickered out, until the ink jar was nearly empty, until his hand trembled with the weight of something just beyond comprehension. That night, he slept in the scriptorium, wrapped in his cloak near the dying embers of the brazier, with the whispering ink still drying behind him and the faint scent of rose and ash curling in the air. He carefully rolled the parchment and bound it with a soft leather cord, tucking it beneath the loose stones in the wall behind the workbench, just beside where the ivy roots had begun to creep in, as if reaching for knowledge too long hidden. He began to notice other things too. The monastery, for all its silence, had become alive with signs, if one knew how to read them. He began experimenting with his own inks, grinding petals from the violets in the garden, testing crushed charcoal from the hearth, adding snowmelt instead of spring water just to feel the difference. And so, in a monastery forgotten by time, in a scriptorium where quiet reigned and candles burned low, a boy listened as ink dreamed. The world beyond the monastery continued on in its own rhythm. Seasons turned shepherds, herded their flocks across distant hillsides. Traders passed along weather-worn roads selling salt and wool and stories. But within the stone walls where Emery's work time unfurled slowly, deliberately, like ink on vellum, deliberate and unhurried. No one questioned his growing solitude, his quiet detachment, for solitude was the very soil from which devotion was expected to grow. And so Emery's, with his ink-stained fingertips and luminous eyes, was left to his own rhythm, to his ink, and to the quiet that welcomed him like an old friend each time he opened the door to the scriptorium. By now, the parchment beneath his hands had begun to feel like a second skin, familiar and yielding, warm beneath his fingers in the candlelight. As if inked not on parchment, but within the folds of thought itself, remember the river beneath the script. The letters, if they could be called that, curved like reeds in water, spiraled like tendrils of smoke, glowed faintly at the edges as if lit from within. The symbols spoke without tongue, yet as he shaped them, Emery's knew, he understood. Not word for word, but as one understands a melody without knowing its origin. He felt meaning pour through him like warm rain, soaking into soil that had long waited for it. The resulting ink was pale at first, almost reluctant to reveal itself. Emery's lit a single taper and dipped his brush into the amber ink, holding his breath once more as the color touched parchment. Instead, it wept, softly, sweetly, like the first tear of joy after a long winter's grief. It did not hum. It did not sing. And in that moment, Emery's understood something wordless but true. The ink was alive not with sound, but with memory. With feeling. With the quiet echo of something ancient that had waited lifetimes to be known again. But when touched by sunlight, it bloomed into gold-tinted amber, a color he had never seen on a page before. He returned to the scriptorium with a heart full of wonder, and a silence within him that was not emptiness, but readiness. But his hand trembled slightly as he began to write. The ink was telling a story. And he was the page. The words meant nothing. Or perhaps everything. He did not know. He had begun to think of each sheet not just as a page, but as a garden, waiting to bloom under the slow stroke of his brush. Where the loose stones cradled the parchment he had hidden weeks ago. With the reverence of a priest handling relics, he placed this new page beside the others, wrapping the small bundle in linen, his fingers brushing the edges with something close to affection. This was no longer a secret collection. It was a living manuscript. A dream being written in slow, golden hours. A conversation across worlds. The inks, lovingly stirred. The quills, sharpened just so. He did not dare read it again, not now. Some part of him knew it was not meant to be read in the way one reads a psalm or a letter. It was meant to be listened to, in stillness, in surrender. As he dipped his pen into a jar of indigo black ink, one he had crafted himself from the soot of burnt rosemary and a tincture of elderflower sap, the sound it gave off was unlike anything before. And fig trees in veils of silver, and emeries walked beneath them barefoot, the stone path cool and damp beneath his feet. He carried a small flask of rainwater, gathered the night before in a clay bowl from the edge of the chapel roof. He held his own breath, listening. And a pouch of dried marigold petals, crushed into powder between layers of linen. He was searching for a new ink. Or perhaps the ink was searching for him. Whose statue stood watch in the alcove just outside the scriptorium door. Not a hum. Not a bell-like resonance. But a rhythm. Like breathing. A slow inhale, a long sigh. Again. Inhale. Exhale. And then, almost impossibly, words. The candle, trimmed and lit with a flint strike and a whispered prayer to the saint of scribes, Immerse would gather his tools with a sense of ritual. His tools had become companions, each ink jar with its own weight and song, each brush worn to the comfort of his grip, each sheet of vellum as unique as the sheep that had once wandered the hillside meadows just beyond the monastery gates. He had learned that the ink responded not only to light and air but to breath, to intention, and when he whispered to it softly words of kindness and wonder, it shimmered just a little more as though it too longed to be spoken to gently. Each evening, when the bells chimed softly across the stone courtyard and the long corridor shadows reached like sleepy arms through the windows. It was during one of these twilight sessions, a dusky violet evening just after a soft rain had kissed the roof tiles and the courtyard stones, that Immerse noticed something new. Not spoken aloud, no, this was no voice of man or spirit, but something woven into the very fabric of silence itself, a phrase that rose in his mind fully formed, and what emerged on the page was no script he had learned. Afterward, when the candle had burned low and the song of the ink had faded into the stillness once more, he sat in the silence, heart slowed, breath soft, staring at what he had written. He rose and walked quietly to the corner of the room where the wall met the floor. The next morning, a soft mist hung in the monastery gardens, wrapping the yew hedges. In the quiet of the herbarium, surrounded by rosemary, sage, and lavender swaying gently in the morning breeze, he ground the petals slowly, mixing them with rainwater and a whisper of honey from the monastery's last harvest. And that evening, when the sun had fallen and the stars began to blink across the deep velvet of the sky, and he, Immerse, the quiet scribe in the Welsh hills, had become its voice. In the days that followed, Immerse found himself moving through the monastery not as a boy among monks, but as one attuned to the undercurrent of the unseen, as though a veil had lifted between him and the world. And now, in the soft hush of morning prayers, in the rustle of linen robes down the echoing corridors, in the quiet drip of rain from the cloisters into the herb garden basin, he could hear something more, something slower, deeper, the sound beneath all other sounds. Even the bells, once loud and solemn, seemed now to carry an aftertone that lingered, like a harp string plucked and left to shimmer through air. They were stories. Short, fragmented, beautiful stories of a monk who found a glowing feather in his ink jar. Finally, when the candlelight had thinned to a faint, trembling gold, he set down his quill and exhaled. The air in the room had changed. It was cooler now, and scented with cloves and beeswax and the faintest trace of something distant and sweet, like a fig dried in summer sun, or a memory from childhood returned in a dream. Not to saints, not to God, not to the spirits of ink and parchment, though perhaps, in a way, all of these. He only knew he was giving thanks. For the color. For the sound. For the ink that dreamed. The ink responded with deeper tones, richer vibrations, and the stories that flowed from it became more vivid, more complete. A way of giving back what it had given him. A kind of balance. A hush like snow falling over fields. A hush like breath after weeping. A hush like love unspoken. He began to keep a second journal, one with stories only. No reflections, no records of tone or pigment, just tales of sleeping giants who whispered in runes, of candle flames that knew secrets, of parchment that rewrote itself under moonlight. Of a woman who embroidered stars into her veil and saw dreams by their light, of a bell tower that sang when the moon turned red. He rose slowly, his limbs wrapped in a gentle ache, and stood for a long time before the small basin in his cell, letting the cold water run over his wrists. He felt light and hollow, like a reed flute, as though writing had emptied something from him and filled it with something else, something older than ink or breath. He brought it back to the workshop and spent 3 evenings shaping it, sanding it slowly with rough cloth, oiling it with linseed, and finally carving into the side a single line of symbols, the ones the ink had taught him weeks before. It was a writing wand now, not quite a quill, not quite a brush, something between tool and talisman. Each tale no more than a paragraph, each one bearing a tone and shape that felt distinct. As if the ink had many voices, many dreams, and through Emery's, it was remembering them all. He spoke less, but not out of fear or pride, rather, it was that words spoken aloud felt too heavy now, too blunt for the things he was learning to feel. There were meanings better kept in silence, better expressed through the careful motion of quill against vellum, through the delicate mingling of pigment and prayer. Like a candle that burns straight, he said, squinting through the incense smoke, or a cat watching snowfall. Emery smiled softly and said nothing, for what reply could he give that would not unravel the mystery? The ink did not need to shout to be understood. It needed space. Stillness. Breath. Brother Iwan remarked, one afternoon, as they polished brass in the chapel sacristy, that Emery's had grown taller, quieter, more still. That night, the wind carried a warmer scent, peat and ash, lavender from the garden, and something faintly metallic, like the tang of an old key held too long. Emery's returned to the scriptorium after supper, the sky outside washed in pale silver from a waxing moon. And he lit 3 candles, spacing them along the table in a gentle arc. The parchment lay waiting, and beside it, a new ink he had prepared from walnut husks soaked in well water and steeped with clove buds and dried mint. The color was rich, smoky brown with hints of green, and it carried the scent of old forests. As he dipped his pen and let the first letter form, he felt something open, not physically, not with sound, but within the space of thought itself, as if the world beneath the world had turned a page. And the ink responded. It flowed more freely than usual, curved in shapes that guided his hand without effort. And with each line he wrote, he felt the presence of something watching, not ominous, not even fully conscious, just aware. The same way a forest seems aware when you walk between its trees. The words came in waves, and this time, they were not unknown symbols or poetic flourishes. He wrote for hours, until his fingers cramped and his shoulders ached, and still the ink urged him onward, like a stream that longs to be followed. The next morning, Emery's did not go to morning prayers. He returned to the scriptorium with a sense of reverence, and before he picked up his quill, He knelt beside the bench and whispered a short blessing, though he did not know to whom he prayed. Later that week, while gathering spring herbs with Brother Maddock, Immerse stumbled upon a fallen branch beside the chapel's boundary wall, smooth, pale, and curved in a way that fit perfectly into the palm. When he dipped it into the ink, it carried sound more deeply than anything else he had used. These were bedtime stories, in a way, not for children, not even for men, but for the ink itself. And in the hush that followed each session, Immerse felt something he could not name, a peace deeper than sleep, a silence that was not absence but presence. He no longer questioned it. The ink had chosen him. Spring had deepened now, its presence unmistakable in the blossoming vines along the garden wall and in the way the wind smelled faintly of chamomile and wet earth. The cloisters echoed with birdsong in the early hours, and the soft buzzing of bees could be heard if one sat still long enough in the herbarium. Within the monastery, life unfolded in patterns both sacred and slow: bells, prayers, meals, study, and beneath those rhythms, Immerse carried his own quiet thread, like an invisible embroidery stitched between the folds of each day. It was as if the world itself had begun to whisper back to him, echoing the tones he had discovered on parchment, reminding him that the language of ink was not confined to the page, but lived in wood grain and water and firelight and wind. He continued his work copying psalms and scripture in the morning hours under Brother Iwan's gaze. Its people spoke no words aloud, but instead wrote constantly on silk scrolls, which they traded like currency, each message a moment captured, a breath saved for later. Not in the way one remembers a face or a name, but in the way the body remembers how to breathe, how to sleep, how to love. As if this was not a gift newly given, but an ancient trust, returned. The ink that told this story sang a song so low it was more felt than heard. He named it Forest Hush, and when he used it, the symbols it formed were slow and sweeping, each one curved as though shaped by wind. The story it wrote was of a traveler who could speak to trees, not in words, but in silence, and who carried a scroll made of bark, on which the woods themselves would write when the moon was full. Dust motes floated in lazy spirals through the light, and the air smelled of vellum and beeswax and wood smoke, familiar and sacred. He did not rush. He let the story unfurl like mist over water, one soft curve at a time. The air beneath the trees was cooler, tinged with bark and fern, and birds called softly overhead in rhythms that reminded him of ink across parchment. He sat quietly in the warmth of the candlelight, his hand resting beside the scroll, his eyes half closed, and he felt, deep and clear, that this was no longer mere writing. It was communion. A sacred practice. A partnership with something beyond name. And in that moment, the ink whispered again. He gathered bark from a silver birch, dried lichen from the base of an ancient elm, and a single feather, a long, dark plume that lay curled beside a mossy stone, as if left by something passing quietly through. He brought these treasures back to the monastery and with care ground the lichen into powder, infused it with spring water, and strained it through silk, letting it settle before adding the finely scraped bark and a touch of ash from the chapel hearth. He had come to love this room not only for its stillness, but for the way it seemed to hold the breath of time itself. He imagined the hands that had worked here before his, centuries of scribes, monks, apprentices, all now gone, their voices vanished into quiet, but their ink still holding whispers of their presence. And when Immerse finished the final line, he closed his eyes and placed a hand to the page, feeling its warmth. Immerse brought out a new vial he had prepared from elderberry juice thickened with iron filings, a dark ink that smelled faintly of stone and moss. He had steeped it for 3 days and 3 nights beneath a piece of obsidian he had found among the monastery relics, an old volcanic shard brought back by a pilgrim centuries ago, now long forgotten, in a chest of oddments near the cellar steps. The ink, when stirred, shimmered in a way that felt subterranean, shadowy, like the hush in the air just before a storm. Binding worn volumes with Brother Maddock in the afternoons, but always his thoughts returned to the ink, to the dream book hidden beneath the loose stones, to the way each new ink he created seemed to carry its own spirit, its own memories, and its own lullaby. He had begun to hear the music of the ink even outside the scriptorium now, in the rustling of the birch trees beyond the chapel, in the tapping of rain on the tiled roof, in the quiet clatter of spoon against bowl in the dining hall. One evening, as twilight folded itself across the sky in layers of rose and gold, he lit a candle, placed the vial beside the vellum, and held the writing wand poised in his hand, letting his breath slow, his shoulders sink, and his mind grow still, as though inviting the ink to lead once again. As he began to write, something in the air shifted, but with depth, like the bottom of a still lake. The candle flame lengthened, its base turning a soft blue, and the shadows in the corners of the scriptorium deepened, not dark with menace. The ink flowed smoothly, richly, forming symbols that seemed familiar though he knew they were not his own. And as the lines unfurled, Immerse felt as though he were walking a corridor made of silence, each footstep soft against ancient stone. The story that came forth was longer than usual, a tale of a city carved entirely into a mountain, where the walls were lined with books that could only be read when sung. He knew then, with a certainty as quiet as snowfall, that he was not merely discovering the ink's voice, he was remembering it. The next morning, he stood in the scriptorium doorway and watched the sunlight creep slowly across the tiled floor, casting golden shapes from the window mullions onto the worn stone. That afternoon, Immerse ventured into the forest beyond the eastern wall, where few of the brothers ever went. The resulting ink was green-gray, murky at first, but when held in the light, it revealed flecks of silver and blue, like moonlight on a pond. And as Immerse traced each line, his breath slowed, his mind softened, and the room grew dim around the edges, as though dusk had entered the scriptorium like a guest, draping itself across his shoulders. When he finished, he did not speak, did not move. The whisper came not as a word or a sentence, but as a sensation, a warmth blooming behind the ribs, a feeling like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. It carried with it no instructions, no demands, only the soft certainty that what he was doing mattered, and that someone, or something, had taken notice. Immerse sat still for a long while, letting the feeling linger in his chest like honey warming over flame, and then, without knowing why, he stood and began to clean his tools with a care he had never known he possessed. He wiped the nibs of his quills with linen soaked in rosewater, capped each ink vial with reverent fingers, swept the scattered scraps of parchment into a neat bundle, and laid his brushes flat on a piece of oiled cloth beside the window. The sun was sinking lower now, its golden edge caught just above the far hills, casting long shadows through the leaded glass panes. The light seemed slower than usual, thicker, as though reluctant to let go of the day. Immerse watched it for a moment, then turned back to his bench, heart full, body quiet. That night, sleep came easily, like a cloak wrapped around his shoulders, soft and certain. And in his dreams, he walked barefoot through a vast library without walls, where the books floated in air and opened on their own, their pages turning slowly as though stirred by breath. The words they held shimmered with ink he recognized: gold, blue, amber, forest hush, and as he passed them, he felt their stories settle around him like snowfall, each one a memory waiting to be heard. When he woke, just before dawn, he remembered only a single phrase: etched in the silence of his mind like a seal pressed into wax. You are not the first. The words stayed with him all day, echoing softly behind each task. While binding a psalter for Brother Iwan, he heard them in the creak of the spine. While sweeping the chapel steps, he felt them in the wind that rustled the yew trees. And when he returned once more to the scriptorium, late in the evening, he felt them in the ink itself, resting, waiting, as if holding its breath for him to begin again. He pulled his stool closer to the desk, lit his candle, and unwrapped a sheet of vellum he had prepared days before. It was smooth, pale, and flawless, stretched tightly over its frame, ready to receive whatever would come. He selected a vial of deep violet ink, one he had made from crushed damson skins steeped in wine and clove, thickened with gum mastic. The color was dark as dusk, but when the candlelight touched it, faint glimmers of silver laced through the ink, like veins of light in evening clouds. As he dipped his quill, the room seemed to hold its breath, and Emery's did too, poised in the stillness before creation. Then, softly, with a hand as steady as the tide, he began to write. What emerged surprised him. It was not a story, not this time, but a memory. Not his own, he knew that instinctively, but that of another scribe, long gone, who had once written by firelight in a monastery now lost to sea winds and ivy. The words flowed in first person, as though spoken aloud. We feared the fire would not hold. The winds grew louder each night. But the ink knew. The ink always knew. Line after line poured from him like rain through open shutters, the quill barely lifting from the page. The memory continued, vivid and aching, a tale of devotion in the face of ruin, of pages written to keep forgetting at bay, of candlelight trembling as walls cracked in silence. It was beautiful, and heavy, and real. When at last it ended, Emery sat back and felt tears at the corners of his eyes, not sorrowful, but full, like a cup filled to the brim. He closed his eyes and let the silence return, the soft breath of the scriptorium, the whisper of ash settling in the brazier, the hush of ancient stone. Later, he wrapped the parchment gently in linen and placed it with the others. He now had nearly 24 pages, each with its own voice, each written in a different ink, a different tone, a different rhythm. Some were stories. Some were poems. A few were dreams. And now, one was a memory. A living archive, breathing with mystery. That evening, as he walked the long cloister corridor back toward his cell, Emery's passed beneath a narrow window where the moon poured in silver white, lighting the flagstones like river glass. He paused there for a moment, the cool light against his skin, and looked up at the stars that shimmered behind the thick window panes. He wondered how many other scribes had walked this path before him. How many had known? How many had listened? In the silence, he whispered a vow, not spoken aloud, not even formed in words, but felt in the deepest part of him. A promise to keep writing. To keep listening. To keep allowing the ink to speak, no matter how strange, how slow, how sacred the message. And that night, for the first time in many weeks, he slept without dreaming. The next morning, the air was unusually still, the birds quiet, the bells muted under a sky that hung low and pale like brushed linen. In the refectory, the brothers ate in silence, the usual rustling of robes and clinking of bowls softened, as though the monastery itself were listening for something. Emery's ate slowly, his thoughts on the ink once more, on the memory he had transcribed, on the whisper that had said he was not the first. After the meal, Brother Iwan approached him quietly, a rare glimmer of curiosity in his voice. "You've been working late, I've heard," he said, his voice not accusing, but distant, like someone touching a door they do not intend to open. Immerse nodded and smiled. "There's always more to learn," he answered, and Brother Iwan studied him a moment longer before nodding and returning to his psalter. That afternoon, while cleaning the shelves behind the altar, Immerse discovered a bundle of pages wrapped in faded cloth, their edges curled with age, their surface covered in a hand not unlike his own, curved, precise, alive. He opened them slowly, breath caught, heart trembling, and there, in the margins of the final page, written in the same dreamlike script he had thought was his alone, were the words, "The ink dreams through you now. Remember us." He folded the pages with trembling fingers and held them close, as if holding a hand across centuries. For a long time, Immerse stood in the narrow chamber behind the altar, the bundle of ancient pages pressed gently against his chest, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he exhaled too suddenly. Dust hung in the golden shaft of light spilling from the small lancet window, motes suspended like stars, and outside, the monastery bell rang softly for none, its tone distant, almost underwater. He did not move when it finished. The echo faded slowly, like a sigh returning to the sky. The cloth-wrapped pages felt warm in his hands, despite the coolness of the stone floor beneath his bare feet, and when he knelt to examine them more closely, he unfolded each layer with reverence, his fingertips brushing along script that felt both ancient and familiar, like a song hummed in childhood and remembered only when heard again in sleep. The ink had faded in places, browned with age, but it had not disappeared. The script danced and curved just as his own did now, shaped by a hand long gone, but somehow present still. There were stories among the pages. Not many. A handful. They were brief, incomplete, and yet each held a gravity that drew him inward, tales of lights in the sea, of gardens that remembered names, of a cathedral whose stone blocks whispered verses when struck by sunlight. There were annotations in the margins too, phrases scratched in hurried strokes, the kind that come not from uncertainty, but from awe. Words like, "listens in color," and "the ink found me at last, and we are its breath." Immerse read slowly, carefully, letting each symbol settle in his mind before moving on, and as he did, the quiet around him deepened, not with emptiness, but with presence. It was a silence that welcomed, not excluded. A hush that felt like a hand resting on the shoulder. And with it came a recognition. He was part of something. A tradition without name, older than the monastery itself, older perhaps than any alphabet, carried not through doctrine but through the ink. He rose, wrapped the bundle in fresh linen from the sacristy shelf, and carried it with both hands to the scriptorium, where he placed it gently beside his own growing collection. He lit a small candle, not for light, but for thanks. Then he sat down at his desk, hands folded, eyes closed. He did not write that evening. Instead, he listened. He listened to the wood of the walls, dry and creaking in the cooling air. He listened to the shifting of wax in the candle's dish. He listened to the ink jars, sealed and silent, and felt their sleeping hum, like the breathing of old friends resting nearby. In the quiet, he let his own breath slow, his body loosen, his thoughts grow soft. And as he sat, the smallest sense of joy rose in him, not exuberant, not loud, but the quiet joy of knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. The days that followed were slower, deeper, like moving through water. Immerse found himself drawn more and more often to the forest just beyond the monastery walls, where the trees leaned close and the air smelled of sap and moss. There, amid roots and stone, he gathered things not for ink alone, but for feeling: fallen feathers, bark shaped like waves, seed pods that rattled gently in the wind. He brought them back in a satchel and laid them on the scriptorium windowsill, where they rested beside his vials like talismans of the world beyond the page. He wrote only when the ink called to him now. No longer driven by habit or study, but by invitation. Each time he sat down, he paused, eyes closed, fingers resting lightly on the rim of the vial, and waited for the hush, the soft internal shift, the silence that wasn't empty. Only then did he dip the pen, only then did he write. The ink told him when. And the ink never rushed. He began a new manuscript, separate from the others, its parchment finer, its margins wider. It was not filled with stories this time, but with a map. Not of land, not of roads or rivers, but of tone and color, of memory and feeling. He inked circles and arcs, notations in the margins: blue hums clear in spring rain, amber ink calms grief, violet opens the heart before dawn. It was a guide of sorts. A key. A songbook for those who would one day listen. As he worked, a peace settled into him more fully than ever before. He no longer questioned what he did. He no longer wondered if others would understand. That wasn't his purpose. His task was to remember, to record, to give the ink a voice. That was enough. One morning, just as the first light slipped over the ridge, painting the clouds in pale blush and gold, Immerse climbed the narrow stairs to the monastery's old bell tower. Few went there now. It was said to be unstable, and the brothers avoided it out of caution, but Immerse felt drawn to the height, to the wind, to the stillness above. He brought with him no tools, no parchment, no satchel, only a small vial of ink and a single brush, wrapped in linen. He reached the top as the sun broke the horizon, and the world opened wide before him, hills rolling into one another like gentle waves, fields dappled with morning fog, and the far line of the forest glowing in soft, translucent green. The wind touched his face like a welcome, and for a long while, he said nothing, did nothing, only breathed. Then, on the smooth stone ledge, he uncorked the ink. It was clear as glass, shimmering faintly in the dawn light, and he dipped the brush into it with the care of a prayer. With slow, deliberate motion, he painted a single symbol onto the stone, one he had not yet written, one the ink had whispered only last night in the moment between waking and sleep. The moment his brush lifted, the ink shimmered and vanished, as though soaked into the stone, or perhaps never there at all. But he knew it had been seen. He closed the vial, wrapped the brush, and sat beside the ledge, watching the sun continue its slow climb, bathing the land in gold. The ink was quiet now, resting. And so was he. The bell tower became a sanctuary of its own. Not as sacred as the chapel, perhaps, nor as silent as the scriptorium, but it held its own kind of reverence, airier, more elemental, a place where the voice of the wind spoke alongside the whisper of ink. Immerse began to visit it more often, bringing with him small scrolls of parchment folded into the sleeves of his robe. Or a satchel with a new ink, just enough to write a single phrase, a single symbol, sometimes no more than a breath's worth of meaning traced into the stone with a flick of the wrist. The birds would often perch nearby as he wrote, jackdaws, robins, even a dove once, pale as morning mist, watching him from the ledges or the jutting wooden beams beneath the roof. They were quiet companions, blinking slowly, heads tilted as if listening to the shape of the silence he left behind. Once, as he painted with an ink made from violet petals and rainwater collected during a thunderstorm, a robin let out a single note, not a call, but a tone. Clear. High. Gentle. And he recognized it. It was the same pitch the ink had hummed the night before. The connection startled him at first. Not out of fear, but in wonder. He had thought the ink was only speaking to him. But perhaps it was speaking to everything. That evening, he returned to the scriptorium with his thoughts swimming in widening rings, like ripples cast across a pond at dusk. The candlelight felt warmer than usual, and the shadows along the walls settled deeper into the stones, familiar now, like the folds of an old cloak. He placed the robin's note into the corner of a new page, not words, just a single drawn line, the length and curve of the tone he'd heard, and beneath it, in faint gray ink, he wrote, "The ink speaks in echoes." The more he listened, the more he realized the monastery itself had been whispering all along. The worn flagstones beneath his feet hummed differently in the cloister than they did near the kitchen hearth. The columns in the chapel carried the echoes of each chant with distinct voices, as though each one had been carved to hold a note. Even the wooden benches creaked in patterns, never quite the same, but never quite random. It was all music. All rhythm. All story. And when Emery sat with his ink and listened, not just with ears, but with skin, with stillness, with breath, the ink echoed those patterns. It was not copying, not exactly. It was responding. Participating. Writing not from him, but through him, like a harp string plucked by the wind. There came a morning, pale and windless, when the prior summoned him, not with urgency, but with curiosity. The older man's face bore the marks of long prayer and little sleep, but his eyes were kind, the color of warm stone. "You've written more than most scribes do in a season," the prior said gently, folding his hands. "Brother Iwan says your work is precise, patient, but there's something else. Something he can't name." Emery's nodded, remaining silent. The prior tilted his head. "Tell me. What guides your hand?" For a moment, Emery's considered explaining, about the colors, the tones, the stories that came unbidden, but the words did not fit. Not here, not now. So he answered truthfully, but simply, "I listen." The prior studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then listen well. Whatever it is, it's not only for you." He placed a hand on Emery's shoulder and left him with a blessing so quiet it almost wasn't spoken. That night, Emery's could not sleep. He sat by the brazier in his cell, watching the embers pulse in their own slow rhythm, the coals glowing like the ink jars when the candlelight caught them just so. He heard the wind in the eaves, the rustle of linen from cells down the hall, the slow creak of old beams settling into sleep. And from within him, or around him, it was no longer clear, came the memory of the phrase he had read on the ancient page days ago, "The ink dreams through you now." It repeated, softly, until his breath began to follow it. And without rising, without fetching tools, without light, he closed his eyes and wrote it in the air. The ink does not need to be seen to speak. That, too, he now understood. In the following weeks, Emery's work began to take on a new quality, not in ornament, nor in speed, but in presence. The other brothers, those who did not speak of ink or tone or dreaming parchment, began to linger by his desk. They would glance at the margins, tilt their heads at the shimmer of the colors, then move on without comment. But the atmosphere around his pages felt changed, softer, reverent. As though each letter carried weight beyond its meaning. He had begun a new practice, one that came not from tradition, but from the ink itself. Each time he finished a page, he would hold it near the candle, not to dry it, but to let the light warm the words. Then he would breathe once, deeply, over the surface of the page, just as he had first been taught when applying gold leaf, to help the glue hold, they'd said, but now he knew, it was to awaken. And as his breath passed gently over the lines, the ink would respond, sometimes with the faintest shimmer, sometimes with a note, and sometimes with stillness, deep and complete, like a pond undisturbed by even the lightest breeze. He no longer feared that the mystery would end. He no longer wondered how or why the ink had chosen him. It had, and he had accepted, and that was enough. The monastery moved around him in its own time, seasons passed, colors shifted in the garden, the bees buzzed lower as summer gave way to autumn, and Immerse continued to write. But he no longer wrote alone. Every stroke now was accompanied by breath, by memory, by a quiet music that only those who had once listened deeply could hear. And in the stillness of the scriptorium, where the ink rested like liquid moonlight in its jars, the pages began to gather, not as a collection, but as a chorus. Each story, each symbol, each breath-warmed line, a voice. Each color, a tone. Each stroke, a dream remembered. Autumn crept into the hills with quiet steps, laying its copper fingers gently on the edges of the monastery's garden walls, turning the ivy a burnished red and the fig leaves yellow with fatigue. Mornings arrived mist-wrapped, cool and damp, while the evenings seemed to fold more quickly into dusk, as though the sky itself longed for rest. The brothers wore thicker robes now, their steps softer on the flagstones, and the fires in the hearths crackled earlier each day, sending waves of warmth into corners that had long held chill. Immerse welcomed the change. He found comfort in the slow turning of the seasons, the quiet falling of leaves, the way the world seemed to grow more hushed, more inward. The ink, too, changed with the season. The tones became lower, more resonant, the colors deeper, more shadowed. His forest hush ink darkened with each passing week, and a new ochre he made from dried marigold and spice began to sing only in candlelight. It was as though the ink understood the turning of the world, and responded not in words, but in breath. He began another scroll, longer than any before. This one he called the Dream Book of Ink. It was not organized, not structured in the way scripture or even poetry demanded. Instead, it unfolded like weather, soft storms of story, drifting pages of memory, the occasional clearing of simple white space, with a single symbol drawn at the center. Meant to be read not with the eyes, but with the quietness behind the heart. He did not seek to finish it. He let it grow. One morning, after the first frost had silvered the fields, he awoke with a word ringing in his chest, not a word he had heard before, but one that pulsed behind his ribs, rhythmic and deep, like a drum muffled by layers of wool. He did not speak it aloud, nor write it, but carried it within him all day like a coal in a locket. And when the evening came, and he lit his candle beside the oldest ink, black as raven's wing, thick with iron and nightshade, he dipped his pen and let the word form on the page. It took 5 strokes. Each one slow. Each one curved like a branch reaching toward light. When it was done, he set the pen down and watched the ink dry. It did not shimmer. It did not hum. But the moment the word was complete, the candle flame stilled. Not a flicker. Not a breath. Then, slowly, the room warmed, not in temperature, but in presence, as though something had entered, unseen, and was standing nearby in silence, not watching, but listening. He closed his eyes and breathed. And the word on the page seemed to glow, not with light, but with meaning. It meant welcome. And he understood, in that breathless hush, that he had opened a door. Not with keys. Not with hands. Not even with intent. But with ink. And beyond it, something stirred, ancient, gentle, patient. That night, he could not sleep. But he did not feel tired. He sat by the window, wrapped in his woolen robe, watching the stars turn through the glass. The frost on the panes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the trees beyond the walls creaked softly in the windless dark. Time drifted, slow and thick, and he let his thoughts move like leaves on a stream. He remembered his first days at the monastery, how young he had felt, how quiet he had been. He remembered the moment he first saw the gold ink shimmer beneath candlelight, and how it had changed something in him forever. He thought of the ink's voices, of the stories that had come through his hand but not from his mind. He thought of the other scribe, the one whose pages he had found. He thought of the robin's song, of the flame that stilled. And in all these things, he felt no fear. Only gratitude. The ink had given him more than voice. It had given him place. And in return, he had given it form. They had made a pact, wordless and sacred, each shaped by the other. When he returned to the scriptorium the next day, he brought no ink, no quill, no scroll. Instead, he came only with open hands. He sat before the window, where the light fell warmest in the late morning, and let the silence speak. He sat there a long time, listening. And then he smiled. Because beneath the quiet, beneath the wind against the window panes and the faint murmur of brothers in the garden below, he heard it again. The ink's breath. Not calling. Not urging. Just resting. And he knew then what he had suspected for some time. The ink did not dream through him alone. It dreamt through the wind. Through stone. Through bird song. Through the hush between prayers. And most of all, it dreamt through the waiting. Waiting for those who would be still enough to listen. Waiting for the breath before the first letter. The moment before the candle is lit. The hush that comes just before a story begins. Or ends. The days grew shorter now, and the sun lingered low even at its peak, casting long, slanting light through the tall chapel windows and bathing the cloisters in quiet gold. The garden, once wild with mint and bees, now stood bare and dreaming beneath a soft coat of frost, and the brothers moved slower, their robes heavy with the season's weight. Even the bells rang deeper, as though muffled by snow not yet fallen, and the very stones of the monastery seemed to whisper of rest. Immerse welcomed the stillness. He began to write less, not out of weariness, but out of reverence for the silence that had begun to speak more clearly than the page. There were mornings when he sat for hours with parchment unrolled before him, ink and quill close at hand, yet no mark appeared. And yet, those were not empty hours. They were full. Brimming with the breath before a word, the space of thought makes before taking shape. He had come to understand that writing did not begin with the hand. It began with listening. The dream book, now nearly half filled, rested in a carved box beneath his desk, no longer hidden, but protected. Within its pages were not just stories and symbols, but shifts in air, fragments of memory, silent songs that shaped the world around them. Each line a ripple. Each mark a moment made visible. One afternoon, as pale light pooled in the corners of the scriptorium, Immerse reached for a vial of ink he had not used in many weeks, a thick, slow mixture made from ground cedar soot, mixed with a trace of salt drawn from tears he had wept one night without knowing why. The ink was nearly black, but held within it a faint shimmer, like moonlight reflected on deep water. He uncapped the vial, and for a long while, he simply held it near the candle, watching the way the light moved through it, slow and pulsing, like breath. Then, without expectation, he dipped his pen and let it touch the page. The line he drew curved gently, then rose into a spiral, not planned, not traced, but natural, like a fern uncurling or smoke rising. And as he watched it settle, he felt the weight of something shift within him, not heavier, but deeper, like stepping into a chamber beneath the earth you never knew existed. The story that emerged was not one he had ever imagined. It was a story told in silence. No words. No dialogue. Only marks. Curves. Pauses. Spaces. It was not meant to be read in the usual way, but felt. A reader would not understand it with the eyes alone, but with the hush behind their breath, the soft rhythm of the pulse in their fingertips. And when the final line was drawn, a mark shaped like an open door, Immerse set down the pen and let his hand fall still. He sat back, and the silence around him bloomed. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy, shaking frost from its edges in quiet bursts. Inside, the shadows lengthened, drawing the room into softness. And in that moment, he realized something. He had not been writing alone. Never had. The ink had always been watching, remembering, dreaming. It had chosen him not for what he knew, but for what he was willing to unlearn. Not for his discipline, but for his quiet. Not for his voice, but for his silence. And now, the ink no longer needed to speak. It only needed to rest. That evening, Immerse climbed once more to the bell tower, carrying with him no parchment, no tools, only a single candle cupped in his hands. The sky above was a soft woolen gray, and the hills stretched away in muted blues and browns, their outlines softened by mist. He reached the top and lit the candle, holding it against the breeze, letting its flame offer warmth to the cold stones. He sat there for a long time, breathing in the hush, the wind's soft song through the rafters, the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the fields. And when the candle guttered low and the wax spilled over his fingers, he did not move. He only closed his eyes. And in that gentle dark, he heard it again. Not a hum. Not a tone. Not a voice. But a stillness that welcomed. A silence that knew his name. And in that silence, he felt the ink exhale. As though it, too, had finished writing for a while. As though it, too, would dream now. Winter settled upon the hills like a hush drawn thick across the land, tucking every tree and stone and footpath beneath a quiet that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The first snow arrived without ceremony, drifting down in slow, weightless spirals during morning prayer, cloaking the cloisters in white and muffling the sound of footsteps along the walkways. Fires were lit earlier now, and the scent of peat smoke curled through the halls like memory, warm and old and familiar. Within the scriptorium, the cold pressed against the windows and crept along the flagstones, but Immerse hardly noticed. He sat at his desk wrapped in wool, hands warmed by the gentle nearness of a flame. And when he worked, the chill seemed to retreat, drawn back by the ink's soft breath. He did not write as often now. Not out of fatigue, but from a deep understanding that rest, too, was part of the rhythm. The ink taught him that. There were evenings he would simply sit with a blank sheet stretched before him, the tools ready, the candle steady, and yet no mark would be made. Instead, he listened to the stillness, to the quiet presence of the ink, to the long, slow turning of something just beneath perception. And that was enough. The ink did not demand. It waited. It dreamed. On the longest night of the year, when the sun dipped early behind the hills and twilight spilled across the land like blue velvet, Immerse prepared a special ink, one he had been saving. He had made it in autumn, from boiled walnut husks, clove, and crushed amethyst, a deep purple so dark it nearly drank the light. He called it Nightfold. It had never been used. It had only waited, sealed tightly in a waxed bottle, until he felt the moment was right. And now, as the bells rang softly for the last service of the day, and the monastery settled into its breathless midwinter hush, he brought the vial to the desk, set it beside a fresh sheet of parchment, and lit a single taper. The flame bent gently in the still air, casting gold along the page's edges. He opened the ink. It did not shimmer. It did not hum. But the room shifted, quietly, subtly, as though the very walls had leaned closer. He dipped his pen, closed his eyes, and waited. When he began to write, the strokes came slowly, drawn from someplace deeper than thought. He did not rush. He let the ink guide him, let the breath between each line tell him when to move, when to pause, when to press the nib a little deeper into the page. The words came like snowflakes, unique, soft, and sure, and each one left a quiet resonance in its wake, as though the parchment had absorbed not only pigment but purpose. The story was not long. Just a page. But in that page, the ink wrote of winter. Not as a season, but as a presence. A keeper of silence. A guardian of roots. A listener of dreams buried deep. And at the end of the final line, Immerse did not sign his name. He did not leave a mark. He only pressed the palm of his hand gently to the parchment and breathed out. A long, soft exhale. A farewell. Or perhaps a blessing. He rolled the page and tied it with linen thread, then placed it with the others, each one resting in its own quiet, each one holding the hush of its making. The dream book was nearly complete now, though he did not think of it in terms of endings. It was a cycle, like the turning of the year, like the rise and fall of flame. There would be more pages. Perhaps not from him, but from others. He knew, now, that he had not been chosen alone. There were others, scattered like stars across the world's great night, who had also heard the ink's call. In abbeys, perhaps. In forest hermitages. In cities. In ruins. Anywhere the hush was deep enough to hold a voice that did not speak in sound. He was part of a long line. A lineage of listening. And the ink, patient and eternal, flowed through them all. That night, he slept deeply. Deeper than ever before. The dreams that came were soft and slow, full of light filtered through leaves, of old languages sung by stone, of feathered ink that floated before touching the page. And in the dream, someone sat beside him, just out of sight. They did not speak, but their breath matched his. And when he woke, the candle was still lit, and the room was full of peace. The days that followed the solstice passed like gently turning pages, quiet, deliberate, marked by stillness and snow. The world outside the monastery had grown softer, its edges rounded by frost and hush, and within its walls, the lives of the brothers continued in steady devotion. But for Immerse, something had shifted. He moved through the days with a deeper quiet now, as though he carried a candle cupped within his chest, its flame too sacred to be disturbed by noise or haste. He no longer hurried to the scriptorium, nor waited for stories to arrive. Instead, he allowed himself to simply be among the ink, among the pages, among the glimmering stillness that had become as familiar to him now as the beat of his own heart. Some evenings, he did nothing more than open a vial of ink and place it near the window, watching how the moonlight touched it, how the shadows played along its surface. The ink did not always respond. But when it did, he felt it not as a sound or sight, but as warmth. He had learned that warmth could be a form of language. He had come to know that silence, too, could speak. It was on a morning wrapped in silver mist that he received a letter, rare, for the brothers seldom received news from beyond the hills, and rarer still for one to be addressed to him directly. The parchment was worn and wax-sealed with a simple circle, the mark of a distant monastery Immerse had only ever heard spoken of in the library's oldest records. He opened it slowly, hands calm, heart quiet, and read the message inside. The letter contained no formal greeting, no closing prayer, just a single line written in a soft, slanting hand. "The ink has found us again." Beneath it, a signature formed from two interwoven symbols, one of which Immerse recognized as a mark he had once drawn by candlelight, not as a word, but as a feeling, invitation. He folded the letter with reverence, placed it among the pages of the dream book, and understood, without doubt, that he had never been alone in this. The ink, ever dreaming, had been flowing quietly through the hands of many, forming a current beneath the world, winding through centuries, whispering its stories into the hands of those who listened. And now, it was rising again. He continued his quiet rituals, rising before the bells, breathing in the morning's hush, stirring his inks with slow circles as the sun crept gently across the stone floor. He collected snow to melt for mixing, crushed dried juniper berries for their cool scent, and began using a new brush fashioned from the soft tail hairs of a fox found sleeping beneath the garden hedge. Everything he did became an offering, each gesture a prayer of listening. The stories returned, but they came differently now. Slower. Sometimes in fragments. Sometimes in light. A sentence would come to him as he watched the flame, and he would write it down not in haste, but in gratitude. A mark would appear in the ink without thought, and he would let it rest on the page, resisting the urge to interpret, knowing its meaning would unfold in silence, as all things eventually do. And in these quiet days, he found joy. Joy not of achievement, but of presence. Joy not of answers, but of invitation. He began preparing the dream book to be passed on, not out of farewell, but of fulfillment. He copied certain pages with loving care, stitched covers of deerskin softened with lavender oil, and placed a sprig of sage between the pages he had marked as especially sensitive to breath and light. He did not know to whom it would go, nor when, but he trusted the ink to choose, as it had always done. One night long after the monastery had fallen into slumber, Immerse lit a final candle and opened a small scroll he had hidden away, his first attempt at writing with humming ink made so long ago now it felt like a dream from another life. The strokes were hesitant, the lines unbalanced, but even then, the page had shimmered faintly with meaning. He traced one symbol with the tip of his finger and felt the echo of the moment it had first formed, the breath he had held, the flame that had flickered. He smiled. Then, with care, he placed the scroll among the others, tied the bundle closed, and whispered a single word, not one from the ink, but from his own heart, "Thank you." And in the hush that followed, he felt it again. That warmth. That breath. That presence. Not behind him. Not around him. But within. The ink was quiet now. But its dream had been written. And it would continue. Somewhere. In someone. The winter deepened, as it always does, snow falling in thicker silence, the air growing sharper in the lungs, and the days shorter still, as though the sun, too, sought rest behind the hills. Yet within the monastery, the warmth endured. Fires burned steadily. Bread was shared with reverent quiet. Psalms echoed through stone chambers, their notes rising gently to meet the frost-cloaked rafters like breath in the cold. And in the scriptorium, Immerse continued his slow, sacred work, not to add, not to finish, but to tend. He tended the ink the way one tends a candle's flame, protecting it from drafts, watching its dance, feeding it only what it needs. He no longer sought to write something meaningful. He had come to understand that the act of listening itself was the meaning. Each morning, after prayer, he would return to his desk and unroll a fresh page, not always with the intention to mark it, but simply to allow it to be. To breathe the same air, to sit beside him as the ink stirred in its jars. Sometimes he would light 2 candles, placing one on either side of the parchment as though setting a space at a table. And there he would sit. Still. Listening. Remembering. He began to dream of parchment even while awake, folds of it fluttering like wings, blank scrolls unraveling endlessly through doorways that never fully opened. These were not troubling visions. They were soft, familiar, like a memory that rests quietly just beneath waking thought. In one such dream, he stood in a forest where every tree bore writing on its bark, and the wind moved between the trunks not with rustling, but with whispering, a language without grammar, but not without sense. He woke with a sense of completion so profound he did not need to write it down. The dream had already been inked, somewhere, by someone. One evening, long after most had taken to their beds, Immerse returned to the bell tower with nothing in hand, no brush, no parchment, not even a vial of ink. He climbed the winding steps slowly, not from fatigue, but from reverence, each footfall against the stone a silent litany. At the top, the air was still and sharp. The snow-covered hills gleamed under the moon's cold light, and the trees below stood in breathless rows, their limbs outlined in silver. He leaned against the stone ledge, his fingers pressed to the smooth surface where he had once written that first invisible mark. The wind passed gently over him, lifting his hair, brushing his cheeks, and he closed his eyes and let it move through him. He did not ask it anything. He did not offer anything in return. He simply was. And in that being, he heard it again, not as sound, but as certainty. The ink dreams through you now. It was not a message. It was not new. It was a remembering. A returning. And in that soft returning, Immerse smiled, not with pride, but with peace. The following morning, he awoke before the bells, the sky still dark beyond his chamber window. He rose quietly, lit no candle, and dressed by touch alone. When he stepped into the hallway, the monastery was utterly silent, wrapped in that rare hour before motion, quiet before murmurs, before prayer. It felt as though the stones themselves were sleeping. He walked to the scriptorium, his bare feet soundless on the cold floor, and entered without hesitation. He did not light the fire. He did not open his inks. He simply crossed the room and stood before the large cabinet where he kept the dream book. And slowly, gently, he removed it from its resting place. The book was heavier now, not in weight, but in presence. It had been formed of hundreds of soft, deliberate hours. Of breath and ink and listening. And now, it was whole. Not finished. Not complete. But whole. He held it for a long moment in both hands, then laid it softly upon the table and opened it to the first page. There, in faint blue ink, was his first stroke, the beginning of the journey. A line drawn with uncertainty, but also with wonder. The ink shimmered slightly under the faintest morning light that now crept through the window, catching on the page like dew on a cobweb. He turned the next page. And the next. Slowly, reverently, as one walks through a familiar garden. Each symbol, each curve, each mark of breath and stillness, each felt alive. He reached the final page and let it rest open. And without thinking, without needing to think, he dipped his finger into a small jar of ochre that had been left open from the day before. And with that finger, he pressed a single circle into the lower corner of the page. A closing. A beginning. Both. He set the book aside, wrapped it in the cloth he had prepared weeks before, and placed it within a satchel made of rough linen and leather ties. It was ready. Not to be sent. Not to be stored. But to be given. To the next one. Wherever they might be. And when the ink was ready, it would find them. As it had found him. The next morning, snow fell steadily from a sky that held no color at all, only light. A pale, pearled gray that made every rooftop and branch seem to glow from within. The world had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels sacred, where each flake drifts like a thought softened by kindness, and every sound is muffled into a gentle hush. Immerse stood beneath the cloistered arches, the dream book satchel slung gently over one shoulder, his breath rising in slow clouds before him. The stone beneath his feet was cold, even through the soles of his shoes, but he did not mind. His thoughts were still. His pace unhurried. He knew where he was going, and yet the destination didn't matter as much as the manner of his going. He passed through the herb garden, now asleep beneath its blanket of white, the curled stalks of lavender and rosemary rising like quiet sentinels from the snow. The gate to the outer fields creaked faintly as he opened it, the wood softened with age and weather, and then he stepped out into the wide, white hush beyond the monastery walls. The hills rose gently around him, veiled in mist and snow, familiar and yet vast in their stillness. He walked without speaking, his footprints the only sound upon the path, the book at his side warm against his hip. Somewhere, far ahead, someone would be waiting, though they did not yet know it. Someone would hear the ink's call. Someone would feel its breath stir within them the way he once had. It was only his part to carry it as far as he could. The path curved along the edge of the forest, the trees tall and bare, their dark limbs laced with white. The silence deepened here, as though the snow had gathered in the branches and held its breath. Immerse paused beneath one such tree and turned slowly in place, letting his eyes rest on every branch, every shadow, every flake that drifted past his face. He remembered, suddenly, the first time he'd made ink with snow melt. He'd waited for just the right morning, when the snow was new and soft, untouched by foot or sun. He had filled a small clay bowl and brought it to the scriptorium, letting it melt by the fire until it became the clearest water he'd ever seen. Then, with a handful of crushed violet petals and a few drops of cedar oil, he had mixed the ink that would later become the first breath of a story that still shimmered somewhere on page 13. That ink had hummed like a flute heard across water. That memory settled into his chest like warmth from a woolen cloak, and he smiled into the hush. The wind stirred the trees, just once, like a voice clearing its throat before beginning to sing. He continued walking. He passed the old stone bridge that crossed the stream, now half frozen, its water trickling beneath the ice in delicate music, and took the northern fork, where the stones were older and the path more narrow. This was a route seldom used by the brothers, but Immerse knew it well. He had walked it many times, gathering leaves, listening to the tones of the wind as it moved between the reeds, mixing moss with vinegar to create soft green-gray pigment. There was a grove beyond the next rise. Small, hidden, encircled by birch trees whose bark peeled like parchment from silver trunks. It was here that he had once heard the ink speak without voice, the day the snow had first taught him stillness. And it was here that he would leave the dream book, not abandoned, not discarded, but offered. A gift placed in the hands of the world. The trees bowed gently as he entered the grove, their limbs weighted with snow. He stepped between them, boots crunching softly, until he reached the hollow at its center, a place where the ground sloped inward, sheltered from wind, where fallen leaves had long since formed a bed beneath the snow. Here, beneath the largest tree, whose trunk was wide enough to hold the memory of many winters, Immerse knelt. He unfastened the satchel, drew out the linen-wrapped bundle, and placed it against the roots, brushing aside a few flakes with his sleeve. The book nestled into the hollow like it belonged there, like it had always been waiting for this exact moment, this particular hush. He pressed his hand gently against the cloth and closed his eyes. He did not speak. He did not need to. The ink had already said all that needed saying. He stood slowly, breathing in the scent of snow and bark and quiet. The wind passed through the grove once more, lifting a few flakes from the branches, and for a moment the air glittered. Immerse turned and left the grove, retracing his steps through the snow. Back toward the path, back toward the monastery that had become his home and his teacher, his silence and his song. He did not look back. He did not need to. The dream book would rest, and one day, when the ink was ready, it would call. And someone, listening, would answer. The walk back to the monastery was quieter than the one before. Not because the world had changed, but because Immerse had. The weight of the satchel, once constant at his side, was gone, and in its place, a new lightness, not unlike the breath one takes just before falling asleep. The kind of breath that says, "You have done what you were meant to do. Now rest." The hills seemed to breathe with him as he walked, their soft slopes lifting and falling like the chest of a sleeping child beneath blankets of snow. The wind no longer whispered. Even the stream beneath the bridge sounded slower, deeper, as if listening to something just beyond its hearing. When he reached the monastery gate, the sun had begun to dip behind the far ridge, casting the sky in long strokes of amber and rose. The stones were warm to the touch where the light kissed them, and the shadows fell long and soft across the courtyard. A few brothers moved quietly between buildings, their robes brushing the earth like falling leaves. One of them raised a hand in greeting. Immerse returned it with a small bow. He did not speak of the dream book. Not that evening. Not the next day. Not in the weeks that followed. But his silence was not secretive. It was sacred. Some things were not meant to be explained, only shared, when the time was right, when the heart was quiet enough to listen without reaching. And so, Immerse returned to his rhythm. He rose with the bells. He prayed with the brothers. He lit his candle in the scriptorium, stirred his inks, and traced gentle lines onto the page, not with urgency, but with care, with breath, with stillness. He began keeping a new book. Smaller. Simpler. Not a dream book. Not a vessel for voices beyond his own. This one was his. His reflections. His quiet joys. The way the frost formed tiny stars along the windowsill, or how the ink sometimes sighed when stirred with a silver spoon. He recorded the smell of winter pears stewing in the kitchen, the way the snow made the world feel tucked in, like a story nearing its end. He noted which inks felt warmer when mixed by moonlight, and which ones curled at the edges of the page if not blessed by breath. He wrote not to preserve, but to honor. Not to remember, but to witness. Each line was a thank you. Each mark, a whisper of peace. The other brothers noticed the change in him, not a loud change, not something one could name, but a softness, a gentleness of presence. He moved through the cloisters like someone who belonged not only to the monastery, but to the silence between its stones. He became a part of the rhythm, not just a keeper of it. When the first thaw came, slowly, like honey poured over cold marble, he stood beneath the old bell tower, eyes closed, listening to the drip of melting ice as it slid down the stonework and fell into small puddles below. The sound was rhythmic. Familiar. And later that day, when he sat once more at his desk and opened a fresh piece of parchment, the ink welcomed him with warmth, rising into the brush like an old friend offered a hand. He wrote a single line, and beneath it, without thought, without planning, a symbol formed. A new one. But from the quiet now rooted within him. A shape like an open palm. A shape like a leaf returning to the earth. A shape like a candle, half burned, still glowing. He did not label it. He did not name it. He only breathed once, deeply, and closed the book. Outside, the first buds were forming on the bare trees. Tiny green promises. And in the hush that followed, the ink rested. Waiting, as it always had. As it always would. Spring unfurled slowly, as if unsure it was welcome, placing one green shoot after another along the monastery walls with hesitant care. The snow melted in soft, invisible layers, leaving behind a quiet dampness that smelled of earth and time, and the birds returned gradually, their calls uncertain at first, like forgotten songs remembered in fragments. The world, it seemed, was waking in the same way a dream fades, not all at once, but in pulses of color and sound. Immerse, too, moved gently into the new season. He did not rush to greet it. Instead, he listened to the changing winds, watched the light shift against his scriptorium walls, and waited for the first day the ink would sing in a new key. It came near mid-morning, when the sky had just begun to deepen into its spring blue and the frost had fled from the edges of the glass. He had opened a jar of old ink, an ochre blend left untouched since autumn, and found, to his quiet surprise, that it had thickened in the cold, deepening in tone, darkening into something altogether different. When he stirred it gently with a slender ashwood stick, it gave off a note he had never heard before. Not a hum, not a chime, but a low, warm sound like the voice of soil after rain. He smiled. Then he wrote. Just a few lines. Not a story, but an observation. A whisper written for the ink itself. A winter rests inside you still. But spring will rise slowly, like breath warming the hands. He breathed on the page once. Gently. With reverence. The ink shimmered faintly and settled. Outside, the wind rustled the new leaves along the cloister path. Inside, the silence wrapped itself around Emery's like a cloak. He had come to understand the seasons of the ink. How each pigment carried memory. How warmth or cold could change the voice of a tone. How even silence had moods, each one teaching something deeper than before. He no longer questioned the shifts. He let them come. As one lets nightfall come, welcoming the stars not as visitors, but as companions. In the weeks that followed, the monastery became more alive with sound. Chickens clucked in the courtyard. Bees returned to their hives. Brothers began tending the garden beds again, clearing away the dried stalks of last year's harvest. Life resumed, not in haste, but in rhythm. And through it all, Emery's wrote. Not with urgency. Not with the weight of messages to pass on. But with presence. With care. With listening. One evening, as golden light streamed through the west-facing windows and spilled across the floor in pools of amber, Brother Iwan approached him in the scriptorium, watching him quietly as he tidied his tools. His hands moved slowly, wiping down each brush, sealing each jar with a soft cloth, placing each quill back into its wooden case with the grace of someone who understands that even rest must be deliberate. You've changed, Brother Iwan said at last, his voice low, not accusing, but wondering. Emery's nodded, smiling faintly. The ink changed me. The older monk studied him for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the edge of the desk. And what does it ask of you now? Emery's paused. Then, softly, to be quiet. To attend. To wait. Brother Iwan gave a thoughtful hum, then laid one hand on the desk beside the parchment. You'll teach, someday. Emery's looked down at the ink jar nearest to his fingers, at the faint gold bloom rising from within it as the sunlight caught the surface. Only if someone listens. They will, the elder said. In time, the right ones always do. And then he left, robes trailing softly behind him, the sound of his footsteps merging with the shadows. That night, Emery's wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular. Not to be sent. Just a letter, folded and left between the pages of his new journal. To the one who hears the hush behind the sound, you are already part of the story. You need only listen. The ink will guide you, as it always has. As it always will. He sealed it with wax, not as a closure, but as a resting place. And when he slipped it between the pages, the candle flickered just once, as though in agreement. The world outside continued to turn. The seasons passed, slow and certain. And the ink remained. Breathing. Dreaming. Listening. Waiting for the next hand to reach for the brush. There came a morning, sometime between late spring and early summer, when the scriptorium was filled not with ink or parchment, but with bird song. The windows had been opened for the first time since the frost, and the breeze that wandered and carried the scent of blooming thyme and whetstone. The light was soft, golden, filtered through leaves just beginning to thicken into their summer fullness. It fell across the floor in shapes that shifted with every movement of the trees, as if the world itself was writing something on the stones, a story only the breeze could read. Immerse stood at the open window, his hands resting on the ledge worn smooth by generations of monks leaning just as he did now. He was older. His silence had deepened, not from weariness, but from wisdom that had settled inside him like ink at the bottom of a jar, waiting, thick with meaning. He watched a pair of swallows flit through the air outside, dipping and rising, their wings sharp against the soft blur of the trees. The sight stirred something in him, a line of feeling that had no shape in words, only warmth. He had not written in days. Not every silence is waiting to be broken. Some are simply resting. He turned from the window and moved slowly to his desk, running a hand along the grain of the wood, pausing by the neatly arranged brushes, the jars of pigment, the tightly rolled parchment. Everything was ready, as it always had been. It was not the light. Not the breeze. Not even the hush that filled the corners like soft wool. It was the feeling that something had arrived. Not something loud, not something seen, but presence. A readiness. He sat. He did not reach for a pen. He folded his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. And waited. It began not with a thought, but with a breath. A breath that felt full. Like the first inhale after waking from a long and peaceful sleep. And then came a whisper, not in his ears, but in his bones. Begin again. The ink did not shimmer. It did not glow. It simply opened. And Immerse, quietly, lovingly, lifted his brush. He dipped it into a jar he had nearly forgotten, an old mixture made from elderflower, iron dust, and a trace of honey collected the summer before. The ink had thickened with age, darkened slightly at the edges, but when he stirred it with the slender spoon, it moved like memory returning. He let it touch the page. Just once. A single line. A downward stroke. Soft. Steady. Sure. It was not a letter. Not a word. It was a beginning. But not his. He felt at the moment the line was complete, a shift, not within him, but beyond. A breeze not through the window, but from the ink itself. A breath, old and wide and deep. And he knew. He would finish this page, he thought. Perhaps this one, and no more. Just this last stroke, this final breath. Then he would set the brush down. And somewhere, beyond these hills, another would take it up. Not today. Not tomorrow. But soon. He let the brush glide across the page, slow and fluid, his breath moving with it like wind across wheat. And as the line curved into a symbol, half flame, half river, he smiled. It was familiar. And it was new. And it was enough. He closed the ink jar, wiped the brush clean, and leaned back in his chair, letting the last of the afternoon sun rest across his hands. Outside, the birds sang. Inside, the scriptorium breathed. And the ink, nestled in its jars, full of stories and stillness and song, waited once more. Patient. Gentle. Ready. The days became longer now, stretching out like soft ribbons of honey across the hills, and the monastery grew quieter in a different way. Not the hush of winter, not the heavy silence of snowbound walls, but the easy humming stillness of summer, a silence filled with warmth and distant birds with bees moving lazily through rosemary blossoms, and the slow creak of wood expanding in the heat. Immerse moved through this season like a shadow in the light, present, gentle, light-footed. He found himself walking more, no longer searching for anything, no longer burdened by questions or callings, but simply walking for the sake of the breeze on his face and the soft sounds of grass folding beneath his steps. There was no ink jar tied to his belt now. No brush tucked into his sleeve. He carried only a small book of unmarked parchment, bound in dark leather softened with time, and even that he opened rarely. The stories had gone quiet within him, not vanished, but sleeping. And he let them sleep. Because he knew now what he hadn't known before, the ink didn't belong to him. It never had. It belonged to silence. To listening. To time itself. And sometimes, time needed only to rest. One late afternoon, while sitting beneath the same birch tree where he had once placed the dream book, Immerse heard something soft and distant. Not the wind. Not birdsong. Something quieter. Footsteps. Light. Uncertain. He did not move. He only listened. The steps paused at the edge of the grove. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. Young. Clothed in travel-worn robes. Eyes wide with wonder. The kind of quiet that comes not from shyness, but from reverence. They stepped forward, not speaking, though their gaze drifted downward, to the spot beneath the great birch tree where the roots formed a cradle. Empty now, but still holding presence. Immerse watched as they knelt, placing their hand to the ground. Something passed through their expression, recognition, or memory, or the beginning of one. And in that moment, he smiled. Not with his mouth, but with his heart. He rose quietly, brushed the grass from his robe, and turned to leave the grove. The new traveler did not see him go. They remained still, head bowed to the roots, as though listening to something just beneath the earth. And perhaps they were. Back at the monastery, the scriptorium had been left open. He stepped inside and found everything as it had always been, jars of ink nestled together like sleeping birds, brushes laid out on linen cloth, parchment stacked in soft towers along the windowsill. He sat at the desk once more. Not to write, but to remember. And as the light poured in and settled on the stones around him, he closed his eyes and breathed. He breathed the way one does when holding something precious. And in the warmth of that breath, he felt it again. The hum. Not loud. Not urgent. Just present. The ink was dreaming still. But now, it dreamed through many hands. Through the child crouched in a quiet forest. Through the monk writing beneath candlelight far to the north. Through the painter brushing soft color into the corners of a hidden chapel. Through the wind moving across old ruins where stories slept beneath lichen and stone. It did not need to be named. It did not need to be known. Only listened to. Only honored. Only welcomed. He opened the small leather-bound book he had carried all spring. its pages still blank. He laid it flat on the desk and wrote a single line, centered on the first page: "You are already part of the hush." He closed the book and left it there. The seasons turned again, as they always do. The leaves grew heavy and full with summer's height, their shadows cool and flickering along the monastery walls. Later, they would begin to yellow and fall. Now was warmth. Now was stillness. Now was the in-between. And in that quiet moment between what had been and what would come, Emery sat beneath the shade of the garden archway, listening to the low hum of bees as they moved between thyme and sage and clover. The sounds were soft, rounded by sun and breeze, the rustle of linen robes in the distance, the faint clink of clay pots, the slow creak of a wooden wheel at the well. A world unfolding as it always had, in rhythms older than words. He no longer felt the need to write each day. But sometimes, in moments like this, when the hush deepened and the edges of the world seemed to soften, he would open a page and simply draw a single line. A curve. And then he would close the book again, and carry its silence back into the day. One evening, after a long walk to the edge of the far fields, he returned to find a young novice waiting outside the scriptorium. Barely older than he had been when it all began. Emery's nodded gently to him, gesturing for the boy to enter first. They stepped inside together. The room was unchanged, dust caught in the golden lamplight, shadows stretched long beneath the high beams, the scent of parchment, oil, and earth filling the air like a memory. The boy's eyes widened as he moved between the desks, taking in the shelves of scrolls, the quiet jars resting like relics on the central table. And then he paused. There, at the far desk, resting on the linen cloth, was the small leather-bound book. Emery's had left it open now, its single line facing the door, waiting. The boy read it silently. "You are already part of the hush." He looked up, and for a long breath, said nothing. Then he nodded. And Emery's understood. He placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, not to teach, not to explain, but to welcome. And then he left him there, as the candlelight grew deeper, as the ink waited once more, warm and ready. Emery stepped out into the evening air, the light soft as a lullaby against the chapel walls. Swallows traced arcs in the sky above him, and somewhere across the garden, a chime rang, just once, like a bell remembering its purpose. He did not know what the ink would say to the boy. He did not know what dreams it would write, what shapes it would pour into pages under those small, wondering hands. He only knew the ink would speak again. Because it always did. Because it always will. That night, the stars bloomed bright in the sky, too many to count, yet each one seeming to know its place. The moon rose slowly behind the hills, casting silver over rooftops and windows, over the paths, between garden and dormitory, over the door of the scriptorium now slightly ajar, warm light spilling softly from within. And somewhere far beyond, over forest and river and field, in a village no longer marked on any map. A child stirred in sleep, eyes fluttering behind lids, breath slow and deep, and dreamed of a brush dipped in gold, of a page that hummed, of a voice not heard but felt. A voice made of ink and the hush behind the ink. And the dream, like a seed, settled. And the ink, ever listening, dreamed on. Thank you for traveling so deeply into the hush of this story.